Strange things happen on the top of hills and mountains. I have learned this from experience. Over a decade ago, when my partner at the time and I were in Ireland, we decided we would walk St. Brendan's Pilgrim Path, an 11-mile ancient Christian pilgrimage that is believed to have been first walked in the late 500s. This path begins along the seaside and then takes you through fields with beautiful scenic views and ancient heritage sites along the route. When we asked the one taxi driver in the tiny town that we were staying in, yes, there was only one, if she could pick us up at the end of the path, she began laughing at us. Then she told us, "Just call me when you get tired." And when we had a little confused looks on our faces, she said, "It's not as easy as you might think." And she was right. The trail was hilly and windy, often taking us through long patches of tall grass and weeds that were up to our knees, private fields, thick mud, and rugged terrain. Once we passed Kilmacudar Church, an early Christian and later medieval site, the next several miles of the path were even more difficult and off the grid. As we hiked up a very long, steep hill with only a few small hand-painted trail markers to show us the way, the incline got steeper, the winds stronger, the sky got darker, and the fog got thicker. When a trail marker directed us to walk through a closed gate, we found ourselves walking uphill through a private sheep farm. This final part of the journey was fun at first, but after a while the fog got so thick that we could barely see anything around us, not to mention where we were going. At one point, I screamed as two sheep seemed to appear out of nowhere, frantically running through the fog only 2 feet in front of us. And when we tried to backtrack our steps so we could find a place to call and meet our taxi driver, as I took a step on what seemed to be the ground, I ended up falling through a very deep and wide thorn bush that was difficult to get out of. By this point, we had not seen a trail marker in about an hour. We had no phone service, and I was starting to wonder if we were ever going to get back down the hill and onto our cabin. Our only hope was to keep going up the hill to the top, which we still could not see, so we just kept cautiously walking through the fog. But once we eventually got to the top, something else strange happened. The fog thinned out, we could see things a lot more clearly, and the exhausting and quite terrifying journey we took to get to where we were all of a sudden seemed worth it. As we looked out over the side of the hill, we could see some of the most incredible views of Mount Brendan and miles upon miles of the beautiful Irish countryside. And as we looked down the side of the hill that we had just climbed, we could see the tiny steeple of Kilmacudar Church off in the distance below. And the path we took from there seemed to be a little more apparent than before. Strange things happen on the top of hills and mountains. And this is definitely true in our gospel story this morning. Here, Jesus takes Peter, John, and James and leads them on what is most likely a long, arduous journey through windy, hilly, and rugged trails and unmarked fields up a high mountain. And when they finally get to the top of the mountain, as they lift their gazes toward Jesus, his appearance changes. He begins to glow, and his clothes become a dazzling white. And then when you think things could not get any more weird, they do. And because suddenly, out of nowhere, the long-departed Moses and Elisha appear before the disciples and begin talking to Jesus. Peter and the other disciples are overcome with fear. And it's no wonder they are. They had just seen this strange thing happen on the mountaintop. Here, for the first time, they encountered Jesus in a completely new light, both figuratively and literally. And many of us know that once we experience the divine in a new light, there is no turning back. Everything changes. Sure, eventually we have to go back down the mountain to our everyday lives, but we do so with a new perspective and with a heart that is open to being transformed. And this can be quite scary. This is true with any kind of mountaintop experience where we encounter the divine and the world God created in a new light. These mountaintop experiences may take place during a powerful retreat, trip, or conference, or while participating in some kind of service work in our community. They may take place when we hold our child or our grandchild for the first time, when we hear someone else's story, when we hug a loved one for the first time in months, or when we spend time taking in the beauty of the nature around us. And for others, this mountaintop experience may be when we build relationships with people who might seem different than we are, when we attend community organizing trainings, when we begin our journey of becoming an anti-racist, and when we get involved in justice and equity work. I think what Ibram Kendi, author of the books How to Be an Anti-Racist and Stamped from the Beginning, posted on his social media last week speaks to the implications of some of these mountaintop experiences. He wrote, "One of the reasons they are banning anti-racist history books is because they don't want people to learn how they constructed racism. Because the more we learn how they constructed racism, the more we learn how to deconstruct it and build equitable and just democratic societies for all people. The more we build equitable and just and democratic societies, the more people of color resist their racist efforts to take us back, and the more white people join in that anti-racist resistance. Because white people realize equitable and just and democratic societies benefit them more than a deeply unequal society ruled by fear-mongering fascists and tyrants, spreading bigotry of all kinds to divide and conquer us." After what our world has gone through these last several years, many of us may be finding ourselves on top of the mountain, or at least on our way there, and it may seem terrifying. Our phones are showing us events in real time of our Black and brown siblings being brutalized by police, and of the suffering and plight of our siblings in Sudan and Gaza. As we walk through our neighborhood parks and streets, we are seeing firsthand the harsh, traumatic conditions that our asylum-seeking siblings are living under. And we are noticing the rise in Chicago's unhoused population. Our perspectives are changing. And we are finding more and more how inequitable our systems are and how deeply systemic racism and white supremacy are ingrained in our world. And these revelations are leading us on a journey, a scary one, of self-reflection and hopefully of transformation. Because once the veil has been lifted, we cannot unsee the truth, no matter how much those in power seek to keep it from us. A few years ago, during the presidential inauguration, poet Amanda Gorman spoke about the journey we must take to the mountaintop in her poem called "The Hill We Climb." I highly recommend that you watch her performance if you have not done so already, or if it's been a while since you have. Her words still speak strongly to all that our world is facing today. She says, "When day comes we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace. And the norms and notions of what just isn't always just is. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken but simply unfinished. And so we lift our gazes, not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true, that even as we grieved, we grew, that even as we hurt, we hoped, that even as we tired, we tried, that we'll forever be tied together victorious, not because we will never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division. Scripture tells us to envision that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made. That is the promise to Glade, the hill we climb, if only we dare. In our gospel this morning, it is on the mountaintop where Jesus is transfigured before the disciples, and now the disciples are being transformed. The hill the disciples had climbed, the journey they had taken thus far as they followed Jesus, is now understood in new ways. And the same goes for the journey they would soon take as they followed Jesus back down the mountain into the Hungry Valley, and soon thereafter onto Jerusalem and toward the cross. But this was indeed terrifying for the disciples. Having this mountaintop experience meant that their lives would change going forward. Once they encountered what they did at the top of the mountain and gained a new perspective on the world, there was no going back to what once was. For the disciples, this meant that once they went back down to the valley, it would not be long before Jesus would no longer be physically with them. They must have been wondering how they could continue this ministry on their own. Were they worthy enough to do this work? Were they qualified? Would others reject them? It's no wonder Peter suggests that they build 3 dwellings or tabernacles at the top of the mountain, a common ancient practice to mark places where God's people had a holy encounter. For the disciples, this was surely a holy place. Plus, if they built the tabernacles, the disciples could stay in this holy space for a while, which could buy them some time before they had to come back down from the mountaintop and face the hardships that would come in the valley below. I don't blame them. But just as Peter suggests this, a cloud overshadows the disciples, and a voice comes from the cloud saying, "This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased." I love this response to Peter and the other disciples as they are overcome with fear, because it reminds us of what we just heard a few weeks ago, Jesus' baptism. When the voice from heaven cries out, "You are my child, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." I love this because whenever we recall Jesus' baptism, we are also reminded of our own. Just as Jesus was named God's beloved child in his baptism, so too are we in ours, no matter how terrified or inadequate we might feel. But the voice in the cloud does not end there. "This is my beloved child," the voice calls out. "Listen to him." When Peter encountered Jesus in a new light, he wanted to immediately take action and was quick to speak. But the voice from the cloud calls on Peter to listen first. You see, when we lift our gazes toward Jesus and encounter him in a new light, we are not just immediately transformed. Transformation is a process, and it requires a lot of listening and self-reflecting. We must be slow to speak and quick to listen. We must listen to God, listen to our bodies and our inner selves, listen to our neighbors, particularly those who are victims of oppression and whose voices have been silent. I love what Mother Teresa told CBS anchor Dan Rather when he asked her what she said during her prayers. She answered, "I listen." And when Dan asked her, "Well then, what does God say?" she answered, "God listens." It may seem strange that today we are encountering Jesus' transfiguration, and then next week, the first Sunday of Lent, we will head back to Jesus' temptation in the desert, which is at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. However, I think it is quite appropriate for us to be here on the mountaintop this morning as we get ready to begin our journey in what might feel like a scary wilderness. As theologian Thomas J. Ord said in his commentary, mountains can bring us to attention. Sometimes we need to be atop a mountain to remember our reason for the journey. Mountains can give us the novel perspective we need to make sense of things. They can renew us. And sometimes only atop a mountain, after a grueling hike, with an aching body, oxygen-starved lungs, and sweat-drenched skin, can we truly hear the voice of wisdom. "This is my beloved child. Listen to him." Amen.